Just a minute, just a minute. This side. Like that.
As I said, I don't know if you need a sound level, but I usually do a sound level. This is John Zielinski, and I'm here today approaching the 50th anniversary of my coming initially to the University of Iowa.
Sounds good.
My name is Avasu Gangway. I'm local producer. I generally dance on my program. Today I'm not dancing. I have a special guest whose name is John Zielinski. He's been doing his stuff for 30 years.
No, 50 years.
50 years.
50 years.
50 years and 30 years with somebody.
30 years I've been trying to tell the people about the corruption.
Corruption, I see.
All right, you guys go
Great.
ahead and I'm going to get the doors shut and we
Thank
can
you.
start whenever you're ready.
Okay. Very good, very good. Well,
Okay, do you want to introduce me then?
yes,
Go ahead.
yes.
I think he's on.
Are we ready? Yes? Good afternoon. My name is Avasu Gangway. Generally, my program involves me dancing. Today, I'm not dancing because I have a special guest here who's going to talk about some very special topic. In fact, this is about children and their abuse. He's been with this for many years, and he's published. He's been an author, successful one, so on. And he's going to talk with you. His name is John Zielinski. We're very fortunate we have him. He's been blacklisted, by the way, but he's going to give us some special stuff. Thank you, thank you.
Yes, I came to the University of Iowa in the fall of 1963. I was 23 years old. I was a freshman, but almost a sophomore. I had taken courses while in the Air Force, and in the Air Force I was an Air Force historian. I was then a broadcaster on Armed Forces Radio out of Madrid, Torrejon Air Base in Spain, and later went on to write for an English language magazine in Madrid for a year before coming back to the United States. By the time I came to the university, I was writing for the Kansas City Star. I had sold my first story to Highlights for Children. I was to sell only 2 to Highlights and see them anthologized over more than a 30-year period, but it became too easy to write children's things, so I started on something else. Again, by the first year I was at the University of Iowa, I had begun hitchhiking across the state. And I first hitchhiked down to Kelowna, Iowa, and began to photograph the Amish. I still have that same 2¼ twin lens reflex camera I used in Spain and later here before I ever got more sophisticated. But as the years rolled by, I published more and more widely. I graduated from the University of Iowa in 1967. I went on to work for Associated Press in Milwaukee, then the Milwaukee Journal, and moved on to Hartford and worked for the Hartford Times in Hartford, Connecticut. I was hired away from the Hartford Times after little more than a year by the Connecticut Commission on the Arts, and I did 300 years of Connecticut architecture.
Wow.
As that job petered out, I went to the Maryknoll Fathers in Maryknoll, New York, and they sent me on assignment throughout Latin America where I photographed the various aspects of the Mayan Indians and literally did thousands of photos and many stories for that publication. But I decided to do graduate work and so came back to Iowa in 1969, buying a house in Kelowna, Iowa. And while I had worked in Milwaukee and other places, I found time to go to Amish communities and photograph. Now, today, It has also been 50 years since I started documenting the Amish, and I have had many Amish photos in many publications throughout America. I just brought one in here. I have literally had them in Life magazine and Time magazine, most of the major magazines, Junior Scholastic, Senior Scholastic, etc. I went on to teach photography at Kirkwood and then here in Iowa City at the Recreation Center. Later on, I was to write a Money Saver's Guide to Photography because I got tired of students asking me questions. How do we do this? How do we do that? And I said, look, I sat down in 2 weeks, wrote 50 single-spaced typewritten pages explaining everything I could think of about photography. I then mimeographed it and handed it out to the ones taking my class. But a year later, I found a small printer, and we put out a paperback edition of that just about the time that Mother Earth and the Whole Earth catalog, having heard from my students apparently about the book, requested review copies. I sent them to them, and I got 2 rave reviews. But just about the time I started mailing books to Hawaii and Alaska and all across the United States, Paul Engel of the Writers Workshop, and I had met Paul Engel years before. I was a freshman and a sophomore, and I took classes at the Writers Workshop. I got to know the family. I ended up taking wedding photos for the daughters of Paul, and then later on, when he married Walling Nye, I took photos of their daughter's wedding as well. But in 1974, Paul told a publisher, I'll do the book called Portrait of Iowa, but only if John Zielinski does the photographs. And what happened was Paul really didn't have the time to write the text. And the publisher handed me another $5,000 and said, quick, give us a text.
Oh my.
Well,
Oh my.
the thing
you
is,
had to do it, huh?
Paul outlined this, and I wrote the text in 2 months.
Oh wow. Good
And
for you.
what happened was the publisher looked at it and said, that's not what we had in mind at all. We don't know if we're going to publish this. And what they wanted me to do was go and take a picture of a downtown street in every Dinkwater town in Iowa.
Oh my.
And this is actually on Paul Engel's outline, history, heritage, people, cultures, and so on. And I had a 11 or 12 word outline from Paul, and I fleshed it all out. I did the photography, I designed the book, and I told the publisher, I'll buy the first 1,000 copies that come off the press.
Wow.
And we had a little bookstore here in on Washington Street, the first part of Washington, called Wayner's Jewelry and Bookstore. In October of 1974, they bought 12 copies and said, can we return these if they don't sell? And I said, certainly. That store, between October and January, February of 1975, sold 900 copies of the book. And I had to have the publisher ship me in 1,000 books at a time
My
and
goodness.
hand delivered them.
Oh
And
my
I would run to
gosh.
Paul's house and have him autograph 50 at a time
Oh
and take
my
them down
gosh.
there.
Oh.
And that book was sold out very quickly, reprinted in only 1,000 copies because my publisher didn't have any faith in the book. They said,
Right,
well,
right.
we think it'll probably sell that other 1,000. And then the following year, 1,500. Well, that's it. And
My goodness.
I got the rights back and put out 5,000 in a paperback and took them out across Iowa to small towns, to drugstores and other things like that. And I sold, in the end, another 30,000 copies beyond what the publisher would
My
have put out.
goodness.
But
That's a lot.
the year after that, the publisher was Adams Press out of Minneapolis, and what they said was, thanks, John, you made us a lot of money, but we're going to publish Minnesota books from now on. So I got Wallace Homestead in Des Moines that did antique books, and they had done some Iowa books. And they said of this, I wanted it to be an Iowa book, but they said, if you ain't got Lancaster, Pennsylvania, you ain't got Amish. So I did a 3,200-mile trip
My
in
goodness.
13 days doing Canada, New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Ohio, Indiana, and back to Iowa, and then took 2 days to go to Arthur Arcola, Illinois, and 2 more days to do Kansas and Missouri. And in 1975, this book came out. But Wallace
my
Homestead was being bought out at the time, and they had a line of Iowa books, and they said to me, John, we can't publish another book of yours, but if you go ahead and publish new books, we'll buy 1,000 copies. So in 1976, I did the book called Meskwaki and Proud of It on Iowa's Meskwaki Indians.
Yeah.
In 1977, thanks to Dick Clark, not the guy on television, but Dick Clark, our U.S. Senator, I did Unknown Iowa, going to Washington, D.C., and selecting whole bunches of photos from the 1930s. And Unknown Iowa was so successful that within a matter of months I had the entire printing cost back. And so I went back to my original publisher, Adams Press, and said, look, I'll make a deal. I'll put out a paperback edition. And I did, and Wallace Homestead bought 1,000 copies of that. And by 1978, I was a well-established publisher, publishing not only my own works, but beginning to publish the work of others.
Wonderful.
Now, to make a long story short, I was doing fine. Where Zephyr Copies is, 124 East Washington, I had a deal with the initial owner, and I had my gallery display in the 2 windows there, and the rest of my work downstairs. But mainly, I was going to art fairs across the state of Iowa, and oftentimes it would be every week I had to go someplace. So I spent most of my time preparing for these art fairs and so on. But what happened was, while I was there, an old man came downstairs. His name was David Sutherland. And he said, my son and I owned the Montezuma Republican newspaper, and we have just sold it and expanded our printing business, and we would like to print books for you.
Wow.
We will meet or match any bid you can get from any other book printer in the country. Now, as a publisher, publishers do not own their own printing plants. There are companies throughout the country that specialize in doing a certain kind of book. For example, one kind of company would do this kind of book. Another kind of company would do this kind of book. And to make a long story short, this was the beginning of my trials and tribulations. David Sutherland, father and son, were to go pirate on me.
Oh my God.
And they put out new brochures and simply declared themselves to be my publisher.
Oh
Now,
my
by then, I was a well-established publisher in the state of Iowa, and I expected that I should have no problem proving it, since I held the copyrights, the International Standard Book Number registration, the Library of Congress card catalog numbers, etc. But I did not know who they were. And it took 5 lawyers
My goodness.
and 3 years before I heard, just before trial, this businessman in Montezuma, Iowa, who said, 3/4 of this town know those people are in the drug business,
Oh my.
the Sutherlands. The last man to try to get him was a deputy sheriff, and he ended up sleeping with a .357 Magnum on his belly. When they threatened to kill his family, he
Gosh.
pulled out. The man said, hey, I'm not about to go into court and testify to anything against those people. They would ruin me. Now, we went on to the trial, and it became quite clear that Judge Dan F. Morrison was with his friends, because he allowed the two lawyers on the other side. C.M. Manley was the city attorney of Grinnell, and I was later to learn that he was called the judge buyer. If you wanted to
Judge
fix
buyer.
any trial in the state of Iowa, you went to him,
Oh
and
my.
he fixed it.
Oh my.
And when my attorney, who was a young lady who got her place only because she blackmailed me,
Oh no.
because attorney number 5 was supposed to handle the trial, and at the last minute he said, if you can't ante up $5,000 more, I'm not going into court and represent you.
Oh my.
And here
That's
we
not
were, a young lady right out of law school who hadn't handled anything other than an uncontested divorce. And she was up against the meanest, nastiest people.
Wow.
And what became obvious was the judge was personal friends with the attorney and with the Sutherlands.
Wow.
And during a Thanksgiving recess, Hillary Strayer, my attorney, called to the judge and asked for a mistrial, and he said to her, you try that and I'm going to have you up on charges. And that
Awful.
caused her to develop amnesia.
Oh my
When I
gosh.
lost this way. Judge Dan F. Morrison said, neither of his two previously published books, and these were the two previously published books, ever made any money for the publisher, and they're not making any money now. I had submitted canceled checks and receipts from January through October of 1987 for $40,000 worth of sales. And how a judge, Dan F. Morrison, can claim that the books never made any money when I had literally made $40,000 from them, I don't know. I thought that my lawyer, Hillary Strayer, should take this to the Judicial Commission, but she refused. I took it to the Judicial Commission. Although Judge Dan F. Morrison had dismissed copyright, International Standard Book Number registration, Library of Congress card catalog number, hundreds of magazine and newspaper articles that identified me as author and publisher, I could not do anything. I took it to the Court of Appeals Court, and they heard my testimony. 3/4 of this town know those people in the drug business, and they sustained the lower court judge. And that's why I became the only publisher in the history of the state of Iowa to have a court system dismiss all forms of evidence in order to rule for a friend of the court. And I took the quote, 3/4 of this town know those people were in the drug business, up to Grinnell, Iowa, and the chief of police, Jim Arns, there, and he shook his head and he said, I know, they work for the CIA.
Oh, terrible.
And I have since met with ex-members of the CIA, ex-members of the FBI, many of them who quit because they found out that they were in a nest of crooks and murderers.
Terrible.
The CIA was involved with the Sutherlands, and the Sutherlands now have been in business for 30 years without being
awful.
touched by law enforcement, even though I met time and time again people who knew they were trafficking in drugs.
Gosh.
And what I did was make a U-turn. From being a publisher, by 1990, I had taken my case all the way through the Iowa Supreme Court. And I had lost because the Supreme Court dismissed the thing, refused to review what the lower court had said.
Wow.
Now, the lower court heard the testimony from me. 3/4 of this town know those people are in the drug business. So in 1990, I began to investigate and publish newspapers about corruption in the state of Iowa. And
Yeah.
as I've just told you, I went to special collections at the University of Iowa Library and was flabbergasted to find that every letter, every broadside, every handout, every newspaper that I had done was in that special collection. And I sent the first set of newspapers. It was called the Uncensored Iowan, and I might mention that Bill Casey, the longtime publisher of the Daily Iowan, is part and parcel of the drug trafficking and the child
That
prostitution
sounds terrible.
and so on. And he literally is on film. I
My
filmed
goodness.
early on for this network here things that I was doing to expose what was going on with children. I had published a newspaper. The newspaper got ridiculed in the Daily Iowan, but it made its way to Nebraska, where the Nebraska legislature was busy investigating child kidnap, child slavery, the Johnny Gosch situation, and I found out that they were afraid of the FBI, but through a friend here in Iowa City, I had made contact with Ted Gunderson, former head of the Los Angeles Bureau of the FBI. Now, Ted Gunderson, Gunderson, anyone can go on the internet, go to YouTube, and watch the CIA and Satanism. Now, you can go on Wikipedia to Ted's biography. He died July 31st of 2011. And at the bottom of his biography is a little notation, and you go to another site. And that is his 8-page deposition where he tells you that the CIA, the DEA, the FBI, and so on are not only into drug trafficking, but they're into child kidnap and
Oh, it
child
sounds
slavery.
terrible.
And that's what
Awful.
Senator John DeCamp, longtime Republican state senator, decorated Vietnam War hero, there he is on the backside of this, and I tell people, if you have any questions, I'm a journalist with more than 50 years experience. I object to being called a conspiracy theorist. A conspiracy theorist is someone who can't prove anything. Go to franklincase.org and watch the film called Conspiracy of Silence. That film could not be done by anyone in the United States. The NBCs, the CBSs, the rest of them would not touch the story. It took Yorkshire Broadcast coming out of England to do it, and they interviewed and took John DeCamp and Paul Bonacci. Now, Paul Bonacci was a young man who was co-opted into child kidnap, child slavery, child prostitution,
gosh.
the making of what they call snuff films, in which he had to interact with a corpse or interact with
Oh,
a boy
no.
before he was a corpse
Terrible.
and after he was a corpse.
That's awful.
And all of this stuff has been going on, and one of the things that I have told people is you never have to believe me. I will give you the sources to look this stuff up. And one of the things that I began to tell people, and what I get is total denial, is that more children have disappeared off the streets of this country in the last 30 years since the kidnapping of Johnny Gosch, September of 1982, than all the American soldiers who've died in all the wars from the Revolutionary War to the present. And I'm about to issue a challenge to the town of Kelowna, where I raised my kids, where I lived, and say, you get 10 people together, 10 reputable people, and we will sit down at one time and we'll go on that semi-governmental website, Missing and Exploited Children, and you will see the statistics that prove that more than 3 million children have been either murdered or disappeared.
Oh, wow.
Now, this is one of the main aspects of what I tell people. As an investigative journalist, I've gone through quite a bit of effort to discover that as far as the FBI is concerned, missing does not mean dead. If we say there are 30,000 people missing this year and 16,000 murders, well, there are just 30,000 people disappeared. There's only 16,000 murders. But I'm saying to you, I think in many cases, the ones who have disappeared are dead, and I have worked with a whole broad cross-section of police officers. And in the Des Moines area, I had a friend who was a private investigator who had a friend who was in the police department. And one day while he was off duty, he took me around and showed me some of the satanic sites.
Oh, my.
And it says, missing children are dead. And I found satanic sites here in Iowa City, satanic sites in Burlington, satanic sites in Ohio, satanic sites in Indiana. And I have heard stories like the policeman in Indiana who was talking about all the satanic stuff that was going on. And one day when he woke up, there was a whole sack full of cat heads.
Oh, my.
And a little note that said, this just could have well been your children.
Oh, my.
And yet, Ken Lanning of Quantico and the FBI has continued to say, up until the time of his retirement, satanic murders, there's no such thing. I met with, through the Nebraska Franklin investigation, and that's what this was all about, the Franklin investigation, E. Lee Orr, a Kansas City homicide detective, who said, the last 5 years of a 25-year work in the Kansas City, Kansas area, I investigated nothing but satanic homicides. He said there would be a cross or a pentagram carved on the guy's chest or in his blood on the wall.
Oh, goodness.
And he said most of those would be called a drug-related homicide by the judge and would be dismissed.
Oh,
But
dismissed.
the thing that I found is in Des Moines, Iowa, through this private investigator, I was able to meet some of the satanic occultists and was told they did indeed sacrifice children.
Sacrificed.
Oftentimes, after they sacrificed children, they would grind them up in a meat grinder, so there was nothing left
Nothing.
to see.
Oh, terrible.
I met another woman who she was a nurse and worked with this one girl who had an upside-down cross on her leg, which is the sign of Satanism. And she said her brother had a portable crematorium, so that after they tortured and killed and ate part of the victims,
Oh, no.
they then disposed of them in the portable crematorium. And also there were other funeral parlors that quietly took care of the victims that had been tortured and eaten.
Oh, terrible.
We have a great deal of satanic occult activity going on in and around the University of Iowa. Ted
Wow.
Gunderson, that head of the Los Angeles Bureau of the FBI, and I must expand a little bit. Ted was head of the FBI. He was the 5th highest ranking member of the FBI, and at the time there was, in the 70s, Ephraim Zimbalist playing Mr. FBI, the FBI story. And during the 9 years that was on national television, Ted Gunderson was the main consultant for the whole thing. And he has left so many YouTube films that anyone can go and see. You can do CIA and Satanism, you can do Ted Gunderson, and you will get a whole host of other speaking engagements. He spent the last 30 years of his life while he was dying of arsenic poisoning.
Oh my goodness.
And I heard the doctor who was talking on YouTube and said, 10 years ago I met Ted at a conference and I saw that his fingernails were black.
Oh my.
And he said, I knew that was the sign of arsenic poisoning, and I began treating him from that point on. And he said, I tried to get him to go down to Mexico and submit to months of special treatment, but he never would slow down. And at 83, he was diagnosed with bladder cancer. And shortly before that operation, he made a major deposition of all of his findings. And as I said, you go on Wikipedia and you just go to the bottom of Wikipedia and there's two little other sites, alternate site or something like that, and you click on that and you will see that deposition. Now, what surprised me is the Kansas City Star. Here is the Kansas City Star from December 13th of 2009. And in it and in the next 5 days of front page stories, they said 100,000 American-born women and children are being forced into sexual slavery in this country every year. And the U.S. government has not allocated a dime to investigate this aspect. They're investigating the other aspect, but not this. And what I have been trying to do is take all these pieces. When this came out, I went to the Columbia, in Columbia, Missouri, mayor and the city council and presented them with these and said on December 14th, they talked about slavery in Boone County, and a Chinese lady had come to see about sending her son to the University of Missouri, and she had been picked up and forced into prostitution.
Oh my gosh. That's
And
terrible.
she had tried to explain this. She did not speak English well, and they put her away for 6 months, and it
Oh,
took the
no.
Kansas City Star to find this out. Now,
Jeez.
I want you to know that this is taking place at the University of Iowa, and this came out in August of 2011, talking about slavery, which is interesting because in July of 1992, I did a newspaper talking about the pedophile influence at the University of Iowa, and I described the North American Man-Boy Love Association. And I said it has a great deal of influence on the University of Iowa. And Bill Casey had an editorial done that said, there are newspapers circulating on this campus that suggest that there is an organization that targets little boys for sexual purposes. We want to tell you it's all a myth. No such organization exists. Within 3 months, Reader's Digest had done an expose on NAMBLA. And if you want to see if those guys who said 8 is too late, you have sex with a child before he's 8, little boys. Go online now and look. NAMBLA and their newsletters are all over the internet. And in special collections at the University of Iowa are some of my clippings from that November 1992 newspaper. And it took Ted Gunderson and his investigative ability to get me copies of their newsletter. What I'm trying to do right now, and my purpose in being in Iowa City again, is to break down the barrier of silence. What has happened as a publisher, I had every proof of who I was. And when I went to the media, Cedar Rapids Gazette, Mark Bowden said, evidence is anything a judge says it is. When I went to my state senator at that time, Richard Varn, he said, judges have sovereign power and may not be questioned as to their conduct or as to their judgment except by other judges. That meant that we have granted judges the right to be kings. If they said white is black and black is
That's
white,
right.
and I said, when Jesse Jackson was around, if an Iowa judge had declared Jesse Jackson was a fake, he was actually a white man, the Cedar Rapids Gazette and the Des Moines Register would run banner headlines. Iowa judge discovers Jesse Jackson a fake, he's actually a white man. And to all intents and purposes, legally, in the state of Iowa, he would be a white man. Now let's get back to 1992 and what happened at State College. And we're running out of time here, but this book tells the rest of the story. State College, Pennsylvania wasn't just Jerry Sandusky molesting little boys. It was a whole network that came through Iowa City, that came through University of Nebraska, all across the country. Little boys were being traded off for sexual purposes
Terrible.
by important people
Terrible.
in the government. And again, you have John DeCamp, who never gave up, who went there 10 years ago, and this only broke in August of 2011, and it's part of the reason my film won Best Political Documentary of 2011. It's because at that time, State College was coming out, instead of being a conspiracy theorist extraordinaire, they said, much of what he has said in this film has now been proven to be true. Now, what's wrong? I can't get this film shown at the University of Iowa, in Iowa City, in Des Moines, etc. Yet I go back 50 years at the University of Iowa. I've had exhibits like the Brotherhood of Man exhibit at the University Hospital with my picture of Martin Luther King. And I was a student here at this university and working in Chicago over the summer when I happened to be on the streets and discovered that Martin Luther King was speaking down the way. And being the good journalist I was, even though the policeman said run the other way, as soon as he left, I ran right down where Martin Luther King was speaking. And I have luckily been all over the world at the time things were happening. And in conclusion, let's honor Gary Webb. I knew and met Gary Webb. He was a journalist who died for his beliefs and for his writing. And what we all have to understand is he won the Pulitzer Prize for saying the CIA introduced crack cocaine into the black neighborhoods of Los Angeles. This book with Congressman Maxine Waters said the CIA introduced crack cocaine into all the black neighborhoods in America.
Oh my gosh, that's
And
terrible.
what I have said is, in the new book I am now writing called American Genocide and the New McCarthyism, the opening introduction is this: insanity. We have just spent $6 billion on an election, while 5 million men, women, and children are homeless in the streets of this country. And according to 2020, there are 2 million throwaway children surviving on the streets, many of them prostituting themselves. Now, I want you all to understand that you don't have to believe me. Not anything I've said here. You have the right to look it up yourself. FranklinCase.org Go and watch the film Conspiracy of Silence. There's a lot more on that website. Go to YouTube. Put Zelensky down. Go to Zelensky Film. If you want to correspond with me and work with me, go Zelensky, ZIELINSKI.John@ymail.com. Anything that you can do to pass the word on is going to make a difference. I have now said there are 5 branches of government, and I'm about to make it a 6th: the media and the clergy. And I've been saying for 20 years that a 501c3 church is a government-controlled church. And I found an article on the internet, quite an extensive one, and I've said that Lyndon Johnson was the one that co-opted the churches into what was an illegal law passed by Congress. And this title of this article said, "Churches, Caesar got your tongue?" And that is precisely what has happened. Around this country, the churches and the pastors are no longer Christians. They're CEOs of a government nonprofit organization, and they know they'll lose their jobs if they actually speak out morally. The 10 Commandments have been pushed aside. The only God that they need to worship is the God of government. And as I said, if you don't get up on your hind legs and do something, I'm now almost 73 years old. Now my voice may be going on for another 10 years, and I have at least 100 hours worth of tapes at various stages. But you, the young people especially, need to look, see, recognize, and go forward and make other people listen. The children of this country are not safe. The death toll in the United States is 4.2 children dead per 1,000. Every other civilized country, we're talking England, France, Germany, Japan, and so on, their death rate is like 1 to 1.1 per 1,000.
Oh, wow.
So we have four times the
more.
death rate. But that's
Terrible.
not all. We also have the disappeared. And in the case of children, there are many, many more disappeared every year than there are reported missing. And that's why I urge everyone to go on to Missing and Exploited Children. It's a governmental organization, and I notice I must, or somebody else must have had some influence. Initially, when I had to look statistics up, I had one heck of a time, and now I notice I can put in missing children. And as long as I'm on that site, missing children 2011, missing children 2010, and so on, and it will come up with a figure right away.
Wow.
And my God, we need to do something about what's happening to our children. We need to do something about the situation that lets a banker or a congressman become multimillionaires while other people are starving, and food kitchens are growing right, left, and center, and everybody is angry because they could work, but there are no jobs. Now, I hit the bottom in 2004, and I had published a whole line of Amish heritage books. And between the books, the cards, the prints, the other things like that, I made a decent living every year. Not what I made when I was the publisher of Portrait of Iowa and a whole bunch of Iowa books, but I made a living. In 2004, the market dropped. And at 64 years of age, I could not find a job, despite the fact that were many requirements for a photographer, which I well filled. The University of Missouri wouldn't answer. The Alumni
Oh, my
Association
gosh.
wouldn't answer, and so on. And so there's no doubt that there's age discrimination. And
Definitely.
today, people of 50, when they lose one job, can't find another. So we have to all work together. You look, you will see. It doesn't take much. Missing children. Get out there. Look. Tell your friends. Give out the other email sites. And we together will begin to turn this government around. I've called this University of Iowa Nazi U
Oh,
because
goodness.
I can't get any cooperation at all from the faculty and staff. Cowardness or corruption, I'm not sure with.
You're
Maybe a little of both.
blacklisted, right? You've been blacklisted, right?
I have been blacklisted.
Yep,
I've
yep.
done 22 books, and yet the Writers' Workshop will not reply to me when I request to come and speak
Oh, my
or
goodness.
make inquiries.
Blacklisted, yep, yep.
And
yep.
I doubt, I said Paul Engel is rolling over in his grave right
Mm-hmm.
now. Because Paul fought for authors all his life. We just hope and pray that people wake up
Yes.
before it's too late.
Thank you. Thank you very much, John. Thank you so very much. Really, we are very fortunate that you enlighten us on this issue. It is
Well,
very, very
I will
important.
come by tomorrow after having cleaned the car out, and I will have other tapes for you.
Tomorrow, Friday, we're not.
Very cold.
Yeah, it's very cold. It's near. It's about not quite 7:30 yet either.
And the problem is
Yeah.
Thursday is probably not a good night. Friday and Saturday will be, and I'll be more readily equipped. And I'm
see.
staying in what was a storage building